Hello students, it's Sam Bennett, your guide to critical thinking, and this is another short video on a key concept. So in this video, I'm going to help you learn how to tell whether the argument you're looking at is affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent, or doing modus ponens or modus tollens. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to present an argument and then we are going to analyze it. All right, so here's the argument. If the weather is rainy, then the ground will be wet. The weather is rainy, therefore the ground is wet. Okay, so our question here is, what's this argument doing? Is it affirming the consequent? Is it denying the antecedent? Or is it doing modus ponens or modus tollens? Okay, this is how you answer this question, okay? Step one is you want to identify the antecedent and the consequent. Okay, so in this argument, I want to look for the conditional, which is an if-then statement. Okay, so I find the conditional. Look, if the weather is rainy, then the ground is wet. I found the conditional, okay? Now I want to identify the antecedent and the consequent. All right, the antecedent is what comes after if. So the antecedent is the weather is rainy. The consequent comes after then. So the consequent is the ground will be wet. Okay, so I've identified the antecedent and consequent. I have it in my mind. The antecedent is the weather is rainy. The consequent is the ground will be wet. Great. Now what do I do? The next step is ignore the conclusion. Literally, you might want to hide it with your hand. Ignore the conclusion, which is therefore the ground is wet. How do I know that is the conclusion? It comes after a conclusion indicator, therefore. All right, so I ignore the conclusion, and then here's the final step. I need to figure out whether the other premise, besides the conditional, is affirming or denying the antecedent or consequent. Okay, so I'm going to look at the other premise, the weather is rainy, and I'm going to think about it. I'm going to be like, what is it doing there? And I realize, well, it's basically just repeating the antecedent, right? So I said the antecedent was the weather is rainy, and this second premise, the weather is rainy, is just repeating the antecedent. So the answer to what is this argument doing? The answer is it is affirming the antecedent. Okay, so you can kind of pause here and kind of look through the analysis written out. But yeah, notice that second premise is simply repeating the antecedent. In this class, affirming just means repeating. And so we're going to say this argument affirms the antecedent. Now, in this class, we call affirming the antecedent modus ponens. Modus ponens is affirming the antecedent, the same thing. So the answer to this question is modus ponens. All right. So let me just go on a side note here, okay? So in this class, there are two argument forms that are illegal. They will create invalid arguments. They are bad. The first one is affirming the consequent. The second one is denying the antecedent. Notice the letters here, AC. AC is illegal. Affirming the consequent is illegal. Denying the antecedent, DA, that's also legal. It will create an invalid argument. Here are the two legal forms. They will create valid arguments. Modus ponens, modus tollens. Notice the ones that are legal, the ones you're allowed to do, are in Latin. Modus ponens is a weird Latin word or phrase. Modus tollens, another weird Latin phrase. Okay, so the Latin stuff is what you're allowed to do. You are allowed to do modus ponens. You're allowed to do modus tollens. Now, what is modus ponens? What does it mean? It means to affirm the antecedent. Notice, affirm the antecedent is AA. So AA is legal, AC is illegal. Modus tollens, what does that mean? Denying the consequent. So DC is legal, but DA is illegal. AA good, AC bad. DC good, DA bad. Think of it this way. A only goes with A. If A goes along with C, affirming the consequent, bad. A only goes with A. D only goes with C, our nation's capital, DC. If D goes with A, denying the antecedent, bad. Okay, so that's how kind of you remember it in your mind. Want to make a valid argument? A, or D, C. Want to make an invalid argument? Put A with C or D with A. Anyway, I want to just emphasize this though. Modus ponens, same thing as affirming the antecedent. Modus tollens, the same thing as denying the consequent. All right, so let's look at another argument. If you save money, then you will have more in the future. You save money, therefore you will have more in the future. Okay, so we're trying to figure out, what kind of argument is this? Let me just do it really quickly for you, then I'll go shorter, okay? I look at this argument and I go, okay, well, where's the second premise? Where's the premise besides the conditional? Right here, you save money. What is you save money doing? It's repeating the antecedent. Okay, so the answer is modus ponens, because modus ponens means affirming the antecedent or repeating the antecedent. So the answer to this one is modus ponens. So if you know how to do this, it can be really fast, right? You can look at an argument and you can identify, hey, that's modus ponens really quickly. Now, if you're a little bit newer to this, maybe you want to go in a more step-by-step way, okay? So here's the same argument. Let's do it step by step. What's the antecedent? Okay, well, here's the conditional. If you save money, then you will have more in the future, all right? The antecedent comes after if. So the antecedent is you save money. What's the consequent? Well, the consequent comes after then. So it's you will have more in the future. All right, so now I know what the antecedent and the consequent is. At this stage, step 2, I'm going to ignore the conclusion. Ignore it. Do not look at the conclusion. Just ignore it. Therefore, you will have more in the future. Ignore it. And now I'm going to look at the second premise. What is that second premise doing? It says you save money. That's just repeating the antecedent. Therefore, the answer is affirming the antecedent, which we know as modus ponens, right? Affirming the antecedent, A, that's going to get a fancy Latin word, modus ponens. It's legal. A is good. It's allowed. It's legal. A. All right, let's do a third argument. Again, I'm going to kind of quickly analyze this just so that you know that it can be done very quickly, and then we'll do it in a more slow fashion, okay? So if the computer is turned on, then the screen will light up. The computer didn't turn on, therefore the screen won't light up. Okay, so I'm going to ignore the conclusion. I'm going to look at the second premise besides the conditional. I'm going to look at the other thing besides the conditional, which is the computer didn't turn on. Okay, that seems to be denying that the computer is turned on. The computer is turned on as the antecedent. So this is denying the antecedent. Okay, so the answer to this one is denying the antecedent. Okay, so let's do this in a more step-by-step fashion. First, I identify the antecedent and consequent, okay? So I look for the if-then. If the computer is turned on, then the screen will light up. That's an if-then statement. What's the antecedent? The antecedent comes after if. So the antecedent is the computer is turned on. Great. What's the consequent? Comes after then. The screen will light up. Fantastic. All right, now I'm going to ignore the conclusion. Boom, just strike it out. Ignore it. I'm going to look at what the second premise is saying. In other words, the premise besides the conditional. The second premise, the premise besides the conditional, says the computer did not turn on. That is denying the antecedent. Okay, so the answer is denying the antecedent. Second premise denies the antecedent. Therefore, the answer to this question is denying the antecedent. Fourth argument, if you don't exercise regularly, then you won't improve your health. You've improved your health. Therefore, you do exercise regularly. Again, what is this argument doing? I would encourage you to pause the video and try to figure out, what is this argument doing? All right, so first off, we're going to ignore the conclusion. Ignore that you do exercise regularly. I'm doing a truncated version of the step-by-step, right? Normally the first step is identifying the antecedent and consequent, but here I'm going to do kind of a quicker version of that, okay? So I'm just going to start by ignoring the conclusion. Therefore, you do exercise regularly, just ignore that. I look at the second premise and I try to figure out what is it doing? You've improved your health. Okay, well, it seems to be saying the opposite of the consequent. The consequent says you won't improve your health. The second premise is saying you've improved your health. So it's basically saying the opposite of the consequent. In other words, it's denying the consequent, right? So I said in the other video, to say the opposite of something is like denying it. So this argument is saying the opposite of the consequent. It's denying the consequent. Now, denying the consequent, DC. Oh, DC is allowed, so it's going to get a fancy Latin phrase, modus tollens. All right, let's do another argument. Sorry, this video is a little bit longer than normal. If the recipe is followed correctly, then the dish will taste good. The dish tastes good. Okay. Already I can see it looks like it's like affirming the consequent, right? It just seems to be repeating that consequent, right? The consequent was the dish will taste good. This just seems to be repeating that. The dish tastes good. Okay, so the answer is affirming the consequent. But of course, you could go through this in a more stepwise fashion. You could first identify the antecedent and consequent. The antecedent is the recipe is followed correctly. The consequent is the dish will taste good. You could then ignore the conclusion, hide the conclusion from your eyes, then look at the second premise. What does it say? The dish tastes good. That seems to be just repeating the consequent. All right, so just remember, when you're doing this, here's the procedure to follow, right? So I'd recommend writing this procedure down and following it. The other thing I want to recommend is just kind of keep firmly in your mind what I said earlier. What's legal? What is allowed? What are you allowed to do? What will create a valid argument? What will create a valid argument is A. A goes with A, as well as DC. D goes with C. If A is paired with anything besides A, if A goes along with C, invalid. A must go with A. Affirm the antecedent. A. Affirming the consequent, that's AC, and that is not allowed. What about D? Well, D goes with denying the consequent, DC. If you pair D with anything besides C, it's bad. So DA, no. D must go with C. AA, affirming the antecedent, that's called modus ponens. DC, denying the consequent, that's called modus tollens. All right, hope this was helpful.